All right, hello everybody. As you all should know by now, my name is Fedukowski. I'll be presenting an accident case from the NTSB. It is a King Air versus Terrain as a parachute jump flight in Hawaii. So June 21st is when it happened, back in 2019 at 18:22 Hawaii Standard Time. It was a Beechcraft King Air A90 that collided with Terrain right after takeoff at Dillingham Airfield, and this is an airfield North Shore area of Hawaii. On board were the pilot and 10 passengers. As you can see by the photo here, the aircraft was completely destroyed, and the left is the actual aircraft a time before the incident, and then all 10 passengers plus the pilot were fatally injured. The airplane was owned by a company called November 80896 LLC, which was actually based out of California, and then it was operated by Oahu Parachute Company, which is pictured here at Dillingham Airfield. They operated under the provisions of 14 CFR Part 91. All they did was jump flights, and I believe they also did parachute packing and repair as well. The weather that day was VMC, visual meteorological conditions. It's a big word. We'll talk more about weather here in a little bit. So the accident was flight 4 of 5 scheduled for the day, and the accident pilot was indeed the PIC for all the flights previously that day. In fact, he was the only pilot on staff at the time, so he was doing all the flights. So initially we had the pilot on board, plus 3 tandem instructors, call them TIs. We also had 3 passenger parachutists, and then of course 2 camera operators, because we've got to get the footage. So a total of 9 people initially. And then during the takeoff, or during the taxi out for the takeoff, 2 more jumpers ran out and hopped on last minute. So for the flight, we had a total of 11 people on board. The pilot taxied out and then took off from runway 8 at Dillingham. Right after liftoff, according to witnesses, the plane banked to the left, rolled inverted, and descended into the ground. Witnesses also stated that the aircraft appeared to be intact before it hit the ground, and it wasn't making any strange sounds. No smoke or fire were coming from the engines from what they could tell, until after it hit the ground and burst into flames. Security camera footage also showed that. It showed the aircraft inverted at a 45-degree angle right before impact. This picture to the right, this is a still image from that security camera. Circled in red here is the aircraft inverted at that 45 degrees nose down, according to the NTSB. It's very difficult to tell, though, at least for me. According to the NTSB, the probable cause was the pilot's aggressive takeoff maneuver, which resulted in an accelerated stall. And because they were so low to the ground, there was no time to recover. Contributing factors included the aft CG near its limit. Because of those 2 jumpers ran out last minute and hopped on, this may have moved the CG aft even farther. And then the pilot's lack of training, specifically with those handling characteristics with that aft CG. So that nose up attitude. And then the failure of the parachute company itself, OPC, and the mechanic that they contracted to keep the airplane in airworthy condition. Specifically, there was an issue with the left wing, that it was twisted from a previous incident, which the NTSB believed reduced the stall margin, so effectively increased the speed at which the aircraft would stall. NTSB also pointed out that the FAA had insufficient regulatory framework for overseeing parachute jump operations, which they, after this incident, suggested they beef up. So we'll take a look at the airplane, or the incident, via the shell model to hash out some of the issues that went wrong. The shell model, as a reminder, is the human in the box, the L in the middle for liveware, surrounded by things like hardware, software, liveware, and environment. That other liveware is going to be other humans that the human in the box has to deal with. And as you can see by the box's irregular shaped edges, this refers to the fact that the human is not a perfect and it's a very complicated thing. So these different entities don't often match up perfectly like we would like them to. So we'll first look at the liveware, the human in the box, that middle L, in this case being the pilot. As you can see, he has 970 total flight hours, most of which was cross-country PIC and multi-engine aircraft. A little bit of it was maneuvering, not cross-country, but not much. And some of it was turboprop, as you can see there. Aircraft he trained on were mostly multi-engine aircraft. There is at least one single engine in there. I can see two single engine looks like. Here's a photo of his logbook. This is the last page with totals on it. There is one more page after this with just a couple of lines written out. So looking at software, things like procedures, training, history, pilot history and whatnot. Doing the interviews, some others who worked for the company stated that there weren't really any procedures or formal training. Setups, one pilot who used to fly for OPC, and in fact this was a pilot who was tasked with training on new jump pilots, stated that OPC did not have any procedural manuals for the pilots or any procedures really written down anywhere. And as far as his direction from the company to train on new pilots, he was told simply to take them up, teach them how to start engines, taxi, take off, and fly the jump run, and then do a landing. And after he's done that a couple of times, he was let the pilot go do their thing. Another former OPC pilot stated the training was a joke. So this is a copy of the accident pilot's quote-unquote training record from OPC. They just took an invoice basically and wrote down a few flights. And from the witness interviews, it sounds like most of this training was done from the right seat. So the accident pilot was hands off the controls, just watching. And I think he did 2 or 3 flights, they stated, in the left seat before they let him go. So pilot training before the accident, or before he showed up to the company as a jump pilot, included a lot of failures for check rides. So every check ride, private pilot, instrument, commercial, multi-engine, and so forth, he failed the first ones, passed the second ones. His training record also showed that he started logging King Air flight time at, it was something like 4.2 hours, so under 5 hours as a student pilot. As he started learning how to fly the King Air, NTSB commented on this, and they said specifically they don't think he was likely able to comprehend most of that training because it's a complex aircraft. He just started to learn how to fly, so he should be focusing more on things like straight level flight, turns, things like that. Also, it was noted in his training record that all of his flight instruction prior to showing up to OPC was from one CFI. All of his sign-offs were from him as well. They took a look at that CFI and his training record, and they realized that his student pass rate was quite low. NTSB commented that basically the benchmark for a CFI pass rate is 80%. That's what they use as a mark for renewing your CFI, among other things. This particular CFI's pass rate over the past 2 years was around 50%, so substandard. The NTSB pointed out that that probably meant he was providing substandard training to the accident pilot and whoever else might have been training. So looking at hardware, it'll be the machines and equipment, specifically the airplane itself in this case, which was involved in 2 accidents before it showed up to OPC. One was a gear-up landing up in Canada, which was fixed, of course, and then a stall spin event, which was during a parachute operation in California. During this parachute operation, the aircraft spun 3 times in flight. During one of those spins, as you can see in this upper picture, it lost its right horizontal stabilizer and elevator. Reading through the witness statements, apparently during the second spin event, the pilot told all the jumpers to go and jump out of the airplane during the spin, which they did successfully do and caught some footage, as you can see here, while they're doing that. And then as that flight was completing, he spun one more time on his way back down, but was able to land successfully, although with a lot of control pressures that he wouldn't normally be using. Obviously, he's missing a stabilizer and an elevator. The left wing, however, appears to have been bent in this event, and that was never fixed. So that's what caused the lower stall margins, higher stall speed. Also, it was noted after that event that the aircraft required full left aileron trim in order to fly straight. This was from several witness statements and some photos of the trim tab. This aircraft also had engine problems. It was noted several times by several other pilots and the mechanic that the left engine would sometimes roll back in power during takeoff, sometimes in flight. So this is indicative of things like a valve sticking, like a bleed air valve, which can cause some loss of power. And that kind of leads us into, well, we'll get there in a second, the environment, the salty air. So this is a blown up picture of that aircraft. During the spin event, as you can see by the red arrow, the right stabilizer is flying by itself. The green circle shows that there is no right stabilizer there, and then that yellow arrow points at a jumper coming out of the aircraft. Here's another picture still shot from one of the jumper's cameras. That is the right horizontal stabilizer doing a jump of its own. So onto the environment, like we were saying, sticky bleed air valves. The aircraft was, well, at the airport, which was next to the runway, next to the ocean. Wow. The ocean, lots of salty air, so that can cause a lot of things to go wrong inside engines. And there was no hangar on the airfield, at least not on the end where the jumpers lived and the jump aircraft lived. So they were required to do things like engine washes every day. It was unclear, looking at the witness statements, if this actually happened. Maybe once or twice a week, maybe every other day, we're not sure. But those engine washes were to get rid of that salt and make the air valves and other things work properly. So that might have been a cause of the engine power loss issues. Also, environmental things was the airport itself is very busy. This can kind of go into other liveware as well, but there's a lot of glider operations going around at one end of the airport, parachute drop zone at the other end with 3 different companies, so a lot of jumpers coming down at the end of the runway. And then there's also, as we'll get into a little bit later, some noise sensitive areas that the jump pilots are trying to avoid on takeoff. So the other liveware being the other humans that the human in the box has to deal with. In this case, we've got the Oahu Parachute Center owner, who was often not around. So he didn't have a lot of fingers in this pie. He was just kind of owned the operation and did some jumps. He was actually at home when this accident occurred. Also, because he wasn't around and had a little oversight, he did not implement a lot in the way of procedures. So everybody just kind of did their own thing. We also have instructor pilots who were kind of here and there. It's pretty high turnover, so pilots would come and go. Nobody was really on full-time staff. They were just contracted to come teach once in a while or fly once in a while. The training provided by those guys was very limited. You've also got your parachutists who are very excited to jump, and they, live a recreational life. So it was noted in the toxicology report that the three tandem instructors all had marijuana in their systems. You've also got your customers who are often tourists who come in for their first jump, maybe second jump. They, as I can attest to, because I was one of these guys at one point, very excited, very nervous, could ask lots of questions, be somewhat distracting. When I jumped, I did jump out of this airfield, but it was with a different company on the airfield. Witnesses stated that the accident pilot would often brake hard left to avoid jumpers at the end, and we'll get into some pictures that kind of show how that works. But it seemed to be tribal knowledge that he would bank hard left, but then do it a little more aggressively and pull up aggressively to maybe provide some thrill to the customers. Some people complained, some people thought it was dangerous. You have got the mechanic. He worked only part-time for the company and only on a contract basis. He stated that he was only there, he was scheduled to be there every Tuesday for the weekly maintenance, but it was not always needed according to him, so he wasn't even there. There would be some times where he wasn't there for a couple of weeks, and when he would show up, he would just do a little bit of work on the airplane, whatever seemed to be needed, and then come back next week. He was involved with a few incidents in his past as a mechanic. The investigation didn't really dive into those. And then he did a lot of his communications strictly with the aircraft owner who lived in California. So the Wahoo Parachute Center owner himself was out of the loop on a lot of his conversations about maintenance. You've also got the other companies, the other skydiving guys, the other glider companies on the field. You've got people flying recreationally in and out of there, and then at night you've got the Army who owns the airfield there. So maybe not a lot of interaction with them, but they do come in at night and fly training operations. So these three companies that shared the airfield were very competitive with each other. There were many witnesses that talked about a lot of the animosity between companies, and they would, I think they said throw stones, whatever that means specifically, I'm not sure, but nobody was really liked, and they were all competing. So there was, that kind of environment. And then that also meant lots of customers jumping to avoid at the end of the runway. Also, of course, the gliders to watch out for. So busy area, busy environment. So the liveware hardware interface is the relationship between, like we said, the human in the box and then the hardware, so the physical attributes being, the aircraft, other machines, facilities. So specifically an issue on this airplane, as mentioned, is that aileron trim tab, which was always in the full left position in order for the aircraft to fly straight. So this was, it didn't give him any trim to use on the aileron if he needed it for anything else, and then changed the flight characteristics slightly. Witnesses also stated the throttles were always split, so it never really lined up. So the pilot had to really pay attention to keeping those throttles not together, but where they needed to be to maintain symmetrical power on those engines. Also, you've got the engine power loss issues that the pilot needs to be aware of and be able to react to. On this particular flight, you have that nose-up tendency issue with that aft CG. So if he's already pulling up and banking hard left, he may be used to the aircraft acting a specific way, and then with that aft CG, those extra jumpers in the back, the aircraft may have nosed up even more than he was expecting when he did that maneuver. Multi-engine aircraft also characteristically have bad spin characteristics, so easily go into a spin and very difficult to get out of a spin. It was also noted with this airplane in the past that when they did stall training, it would often try to drop wing left during a stall. So the liveware software interface is the human in the box again, with the supporting systems like regulations, training, so on and so forth. As far as the regulations at OPC, they were nil or not there at all. Obviously, there were your federal aviation regulations, but the kind of attitude of the company, the atmosphere was to not really pay attention to all those. In fact, the owner himself once held a private pilot's license, but got that revoked for violating certain regulations. The company also was violating DOT regulations. They were given a cease and desist order at one point, and then a vacate the premises order. So they weren't even supposed to be operating at that time. Manuals, it's another software thing that your liveware should be working with. However, there weren't any SOPs according to witnesses for this particular operation. We know that there should be a pilot operating handbook for the King Air itself, but witnesses talked about how the pilot would often ask about things like aircraft speeds. So this indicated he maybe didn't have access to the manual or did not read up on the manual, so it was unfamiliar with the aircraft manual. Processes and procedures at this particular company were, again, not really existing. There was some tribal knowledge, things like turning out early on the runway so that you miss jumpers, and that's this picture here we'll get into in a minute. Witnesses stated that this was pretty much standard procedure to, as soon as you take off, turn hard left and try to avoid not only jumpers but those noise abatement areas. Another procedure that was, I guess, fairly common in flight was to slow the aircraft down to about 90 knots before you drop the jumpers, and this is very close to the stall speed of that aircraft. And, well, depending on your weight, and with that twisted left wing, they could have been even closer than they expected it to be to that stall speed. And then looking at the pilot's experience, as we look back at his training record before APC, it was minimal experience. and that training itself was fairly substandard, and then the training there at OPC was also substandard. Here's that picture blown up. So the blue arrow is the flight path the aircraft normally does when taking off from the left, and this was the flight path that the aircraft was intending to do during the accident day. These red circles, those are the noise abatement areas, so he would generally try to turn out over the beach there, about midfield. That green circle is the drop zone where parachutists are coming in, and then the glider operations are down there on the other end as well. So the liveware environment interface is the pilot or the human in the box, so the pilot in this case, and how he or she interacts with the environment. So temperature, weather. The accident flight was early evening in June. So here's the weather, the METAR for Wheeler, which is only 14 miles away. There was no METAR for the field itself, Dillingham. As you can see, winds are negligible, 1707, 1806, 1804, good visibility, 10 miles there. A few clouds scattered and broken. That broken layer, though, is up at 2,600 feet over Wheeler anyway. So they're there, but they're probably not going to cause any issues for this particular day, since he never made it past something like 400 feet AGL. Temperature 24 Celsius, nice and warm, so decent weather. There's also the ambient light issue with the environment. The accident occurred at 1822 Hawaii time, and sunset that day at that area was at 1913, so almost an hour later. So the light was fading slightly. It could have been a noisy cockpit. During an interview with the owner of the company, the owner stated during speculating of what maybe went wrong, that there might have been distraction in the airplane. So he was referring to the fact that the pilot was friends with the instructors, and maybe it was common that they talk and joke around while they're taking off, so they might not be observing things like sterile cockpits. Also, the aircraft doors removed, so that can create quite a bit of wind noise. Other things like obstacles and noise sensitive areas, as shown on that earlier picture. There's also some trees to avoid, and obviously houses and those noise abatement areas. And then we have the liveware to liveware interface, so the human in the box and the other humans. So we've got the jumpers, we talked about the owner, the TIs or tandem instructors, like we stated earlier, were friends, and so they may have been chatty and talking about what to do after work. So sterile cockpit maybe went out the window. As you can see, he stopped during taxi to let more jumpers on, so it kind of speaks to the environment and how they all interacted with each other. Kind of a non-standard thing to do. The owner, as stated previously, had limited interaction with the pilots and the owner of the aircraft. He wasn't always around, so he didn't provide a lot of input himself. So we'll take a quick look at if we were to implement an SMS system, how specifically the 4 pillars of an SMS could prevent something like this from happening in the future. So we'll start with safety policy, the first pillar. So a change of perspective is what could really change the outcome here, from that change of perspective from senior management. So if they implemented a safety policy, started from top down and kind of set the tone for a safety environment, they could put in some definitions, some procedures, and try to negate some of these safety issues. Things they could put in would be specific jump pilot training programs. So when the new pilots come in to fly for them, they would go through a very specific program to ensure that they did understand the aircraft and understand the procedures and were competent. Also, if they were to input a reporting system for aircraft malfunctions, then there would be a clear line of communication from pilots and anybody else who had issues with the aircraft straight to maintenance, and we can make sure that those things are taken care of so the aircraft is airworthy. And that goes along with maintenance procedures themselves. If there was an actual document or standard operating procedure for the maintenance procedures, it's more likely things will get logged and fixed. And then a safety reporting program could be put in place to report any safety issues and concerns. And then safety risk management, being the second pillar, is where we would implement this reporting system and try to point out these safety concerns. So it'd also be a good time to design some controls to address those concerns. So Some controls may be putting in a background check for pilots to make sure they actually had, adequate training before showing up to the company, and then a training program again in place so that that pilot could get training for the specifics of the company and the procedures. Design some manuals for all of this, the standard operating procedures, bring out some flight manuals, make sure the pilots are getting into those. And then an implementation of computer software could be very useful for this, so they could track everything, currency, hours, maintenance. They could use that as their reporting system for maintenance issues in the aircraft as well. And then safety assurance, our third pillar. So this is where the company is going to look at those safety issues that were brought up through the safety reporting system, evaluate how effective they are, and see if they need to adjust or input more controls. So taking some time to sit down and look at these is a good step there. Sitting down with maybe senior staff and having weekly meetings. It was noted as well that the operation shut down every Tuesday for aircraft maintenance, so this might be a real good time to sit down and do some meetings and talk about safety. And then you've got your final pillar, the safety promotion. So this is where we really get into training. Once we've got those systems in place, the manuals in place, sit down and train all the staff on the new procedures and make sure that they are following by monitoring them. And then hold monthly safety meetings after that initial training period, and just revisit all of the safety items for the month, set some goals. This can be based on maybe some safety concerns in the past for the company or related to other companies of a similar nature, see what kind of goals that they're meeting. And then, of course, putting up safety posters just to give reminders to everybody and kind of set the tone for that culture. And then, of course, every company has an internal marketing program of some sort, or at least they should. So incorporating safety just into that internal marketing as well, just another step to promote that good safety culture. So here are the sources for everything in these PowerPoints. And then hopefully I will be able to call in and answer any questions that you might have, provided my internet will let me do so.